Meninges. So the meninges are actually the layers that surround the outside of the brain and spinal cord. They're continuous on the outside of the brain and spinal cord. So there are meninges around the outside of the brain, there are meninges around the outside of the spinal cord. Here you can see the first one. This is called the dura mater. It is opaque. Opaque means you can't see through it, whereas translucent or transparent means you can see through it. So this is more like tissue paper, whereas the stuff you can see through is going to be more like saran wrap. So this is called the dura mater. Dura mater means durable or tough mother. So that's the dura mater there, and you can see how it's different than what we'll look at here in just a second. So the next one is going to be the arachnoid layer, or arachnoid layer. This is probably the best one to use. If you can still see the blood vessels on the surface, you know that the arachnoid layer is still intact. I can kind of peel a little bit up here. It's hard to peel off the sheep brain, but you can still, if you do a good job, you can tease it off. But the arachnoid layer is still intact if you can still see the blood vessels on the surface of this brain. Okay. If we were able to remove all the blood vessels, like there you can see arachnoid still there. If we were able to remove all the blood vessels, which we don't have on any of these, and you didn't see this shiny layer on the surface, then that innermost layer is what we call the pia mater. Pia mater means delicate mother, and the pia mater follows all the nooks and crannies, goes down into these little valleys, and it comes up over the tops of the mountains. Whereas the pia mater is just like saran wrap. If you had, I don't know, your mom was making a jello mold and put saran wrap over the top of it, it would follow most of the nooks and crannies, but it wouldn't go down through all of the deep crevices if there were any on your little, jello mold. So those are the three, outermost to innermost. The next thing we have is what we call the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure is the convolutions. We've already alluded to those, but collectively all the hills and valleys are called the convolutions. That's collectively. Individually, the hills are called gyri, and the sulci, the dividers in between the valleys, are called sulci. So gyri are the hills and the sulci are the valleys. Next thing, cerebrum. Cerebrum is the largest portion of the human brain and the largest portion of the sheep brain. This is the right cerebral hemisphere. This is the left cerebral hemisphere.
Is that always going to be the largest portion of every brain? Like
largest portion. Well, I don't know about other animals, like maybe like mice and whatnot, because I'm not a comparative vertebrate anatomist. But certainly for, I have not seen the mink brains, but certainly with the sheep and the human, it's going to be the largest part. I think the lower type of mammals that we run into, they probably have larger brain stems, what we call the reptilian brain, and then smaller cerebrum or cerebral hemispheres, because these are more for higher cognitive function. Okay? Next thing is cerebellum. So the cerebellum is this thing here about the size of a walnut in back. So the cerebrum in front, cerebellum in back, and corpora quadrigemina. If I fold this down, now this is actually broken here, broken in this location, but if I fold it down, you can see these two little bumps and then these two little bumps right there. These two bumps and those two bumps. The upper two bumps, the lower two bumps. Upper two bumps, lower two bumps. These collectively are called the corpora, which means body, quadrigemina, which means four. So the two upper bumps are called the superior colliculi. The two lower bumps, the smaller ones, are called the inferior colliculi. And they're involved in sight and hearing reflexes. We'll cover those in lecture. So we covered that. Now we want to go to the ventral structures. The ventral structures are the ones on the underside of the brain. Now remember, humans, we sit more like this because we stand upright, but sheep sit more like this because they're on all fours. So these would be the ventral structures. This would be the dorsal, anterior, posterior. Okay. So on the ventral structures, I did one of these because I liked. I think you could see it pretty well. Now this might be the one. It's kind of torn, but this is the olfactory bulb right there. Olfactory bulb is for smelling. It sits here, and then the other one will be sitting here. It's been torn on this side, but there's still a little bit of it left. Can we see it on this one? There we go. Olfactory bulb there, and a little bit of the olfactory bulb there. This is the first cranial nerve. The olfactory nerve is the first cranial nerve. The optic nerves are still somewhat intact in this one. Optic nerve here and here. Okay. Optic nerve. Optic nerve. Optic nerve. Okay. Those are the second cranial nerves. We have 12 cranial nerves. The first cranial nerve is olfactory, and they kind of run from front to back or top to bottom based on their name. So this would be 1, and then 2, and then all the way back to 12. We have 12 of them. On the sheep brain proper, the only ones that you're going to have to, so this is the sheep brain proper. When I say the word proper, I mean the original sheep brain, not the picture of a sheep brain or not the diagram of a sheep brain. On the sheep brain proper, all you'll have to identify will be olfactory and optic. You won't have to do cranial nerves 3 through 12. Those will be on the diagrams. We'll talk about those in a minute. And then optic chiasm. The optic chiasm is the cross in the midline. So chiasm means cross or crux. So this is the optic chiasm here. Optic chiasm here, where the two optic nerves come together in the midline. Optic chiasm right there. All right. If we look at on a sheep brain that's already been dissected, here it is again here, but that's of course with the dura mater. The dura mater is still intact. But here would be the optic chiasm in the sheep that's already had the dura mater removed. This is the optic chiasm. The optic nerve would pop out this direction and this direction. Where it comes together in midline is the optic chiasm. Optic tracts are actually the portion that comes back from the optic chiasm. So optic nerves here, optic chiasm in the middle, and then optic tracts come back laterally from the optic chiasm. These, the optic chiasm, excuse me, optic tracts, are like the bottom of the X. So you got an X here, or excuse me, the one arm of the X down up and anterior and posterior, one arm of the X anterior and posterior. So the back of the X, these are the optic tracts. Hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is kind of interesting. Hypothalamus is below what we call the thalamus. Now, to give you a little background, this dura mater that's still intact right here, that dura mater that's still intact, houses the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is this structure right here. It's about the size of a garbanzo bean in humans and also in sheep, that structure right there. That's pituitary gland, pituitary gland. But when we peel off this dura mater, we pop that garbanzo bean off with it, okay? Because the garbanzo bean, the pituitary gland, is located embedded in the dura mater. So you'll see the bulge right there? You will not see, when we look at the sheep brain with the dura mater removed, you will not see it. The bulge should be right here, but it's been removed because we removed the dura mater, we removed the pituitary gland. It just so happens the pituitary gland has a connection to the base of the brain right here. This base of the brain right here is called the hypothalamus. So pituitary gland connects to the hypothalamus via a little stalk called the infundibulum. It's a little connection called the infundibulum. The hypothalamus sits right in here. The little hole right there. Do you see the little hole right there? Can you all see the little hole right there? See the hole right there? That is a space that's surrounded by the hypothalamus. So let's show you where the hypothalamus is located on a sheep brain half, if we can do this. So here's a great shot. This shows optic chiasm in cross section. Remember the optic chiasm of the cross? Here's the optic chiasm here. Optic chiasm right there. So on the with the hypothalamus, the way I will do it for you all is the hypothalamus is the tissue that sits immediately above the optic chiasm. So this is hypothalamus, just immediately above it. See if we can find a better shot here too. So in this picture, there's no optic chiasm per se here. Let's find a better one. All right, here it is again. Optic chiasm, hypothalamus. Optic chiasm, hypothalamus. Optic chiasm, hypothalamus. Now, you might be able to see this better from this side. There's a little bit of a sheen that shows maybe a circular structure. Do you kind of, if you hallucinate with me, do you see kind of a circular structure right there? We're on the same drug. That circular structure is also this circular structure right here. Let's see if I can get it. This circular structure right here. That's called the intermediate mass of the, here it is again, circular structure right there. That's called the intermediate mass of the thalamus. So the optic chiasm sits here, the thalamus sits up above, so the hypothalamus sits between those two. Above the optic chiasm, but below the thalamus. Between those two. Above the optic chiasm, but below the thalamus. I said before, between those two. Here's the thalamus, here's the hypothalamus and the optic chiasm. Okay? You see this, Elise? Okay. All right. We told you about infundibulum. The infundibulum is the stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. All right? So once we pull the pituitary gland off, you're going to pop that stalk off and you won't see it. So you won't see the infundibulum. Just know it connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. The next thing that you have is the mammillary body. Now the mammillary body, boy, I'm not seeing a good one on the mammillary body. All right, we might be able to kind of see it here. Here's the optic chiasm. Pituitary gland would set right in here. Optic chiasm, pituitary gland, and then this area about here is called the mammillary body. It's right behind where the infundibulum would set. So optic chiasm, pituitary gland would set here. That's hypothalamus here. And this little tissue right here is called the mammillary body. This one's kind of torn up, so we don't see a good shot of it. This one's not. All right, this isn't too bad. Optic chiasm is here. Pituitary gland, it's set right there. And then this little bulge, we see one on both sides. This little bulge right here is called the mammillary body. It's larger in humans than it is in sheep. And there's one on each side, one here and one there, so they look like small breasts, hence the term mammillary tissue or mammillary body. Okay? Cerebral peduncle. So the next thing is the cerebral peduncle. Where's my TA? Athena, can you get me another full brain? It's got probably a better undersurface to it. So the cerebral peduncle is actually this tissue right here. So let's back up and explain something. This is the cerebrum. This is the cerebrum. This is all brain stem right here, brain stem. So the cerebral peduncle is actually connection fibers between the brain stem going up into the cerebrum. So this is cerebral peduncle here, it's part of the brain stem, cerebral peduncle right there, part of the brain stem. So I liken it to the stalk that's on a, let's say, cauliflower or broccoli. So the cerebral peduncle would be the stalk that goes up into the floret, of the broccoli, which would be the cerebrum, right? Does that make sense?
You kind of tilt it this way. Sure.
You bet. So cerebral peduncle is the front part of this structure here, which is called the midbrain. We'll cover that in a second. So here's the floret, and here's the cerebral peduncle going up, the stalk that's going up into the floret. Okay? Let's see. Oculomotor nerve. So we're going to cover those. We're going to cover oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, pons, medulla oblongata, trigeminal nerve, abducens nerve, facial nerve, vestibulocochlear nerve, accessory nerve, hypoglossal nerve on the diagram of the sheep brain that we'll have later on. Those both have, those both have the meninges still on it, the dura. We want to find one that, so this one doesn't have dura. We'll see if we can find one that's got a better underside to it. Thank you. No worries. You didn't know that. I didn't tell you. So let's see. Let's now cover the inside, the internal structures. I have a few good ones for internal structures. This is called the third, or the lateral ventricle. See that? Looks like a mouth right there. See the mouth?
Sorry, I missed the...
It's the mouth, okay? Siri, come on. So there's the mouth right there. That's called the lateral ventricle. Mouth is the lateral ventricle. Okay? The upper lip of the lateral ventricle is called the corpus callosum. These are actually connection fibers between the left and right halves of the brain. So the upper lip, corpus callosum. The lower lip is called the fornix. Lower lip right there, the fornix. Lower lip. So corpus callosum, lateral ventricle, lower lip is the fornix. Alrighty? Did you see that? Okay. So lateral ventricle, we covered that. Third ventricle. So here's what I wanted to talk to you guys about regarding the third ventricle. Let's go back to the hypothalamus. This is the optic chiasm. This is thalamic tissue right there. Hypothalamus is between those two, below the thalamus, above the optic chiasm, right? Remember that? Hard to see on this one. We might be able to see a little bit better on a different one. I had a good one I thought I saw. I taught. So this is not great, but if we cut right, oh, there it is. Oh, this is awesome. I've never seen one of these before. But that little space, so let's back up. This is hypothalamic tissue, okay? Hypothalamic tissue is this tissue I'm lifting up. You see that? So the third ventricle, this is the lateral ventricle. Lateral ventricle is right here. Corpus callosum, fornix right there. You with me? So the hypothalamus is below the thalamus. Thalamus is up here, hypothalamus below, optic chiasm down below, correct? So the third ventricle is sandwiched by the two sides of the hypothalamus. So Celeste, if you looked straight at me and we said the blue, my gloves would represent, my hands would represent hypothalamic tissue, if we brought those two halves together, you would see that there's a space between. That space is the third ventricle. Ventricles are spaces inside the brain. So third ventricle, hypothalamic tissue, third ventricle is my space right here. You with me? So when we cut through the middle of the sheep brain, we hope to slice through the middle, and then we fillet this open, and we would say that this little pocket here would be third ventricle, but the tissue would be hypothalamus. So there's really no way, when we lay these dudes out, there's no way to delineate one from the other except for the one I just showed you, but there's no way to really delineate. So if we put a pin right in here, and we said, what is this tissue between the optic chiasm and the thalamus? We put a pin in there and we said, what is that tissue? You would say what?
Hypothalamus.
Hypothalamus, thank you very much. If we said, what would the ventricle be here? You would say? Third ventricle, very good. That's what we would say. And this is one of the few that I've ever seen where you can actually lift that up because it wasn't cut directly in the midline. Where the probe is right now is the third ventricle, but the tissue that I'm lifting up is what? Oh, no, you're good. Is what? Hypothalamus. Thank you so much. So again, this right here is the cerebral peduncle. Okay, the front part of the midbrain. This is going to be the florets, which would be, as we said before, the cerebrum. So these are basically nothing more than connection fibers between the cerebrum and the brainstem itself. Brainstem is you've heard that term before, your reptilian brain. And then the cerebrum will be your higher brain. Okay. Pineal body is the next thing that we want to discuss. All right. They're very hard to find because we typically remove them when we cut them in these brains in half. So the pineal body sits right in the midline again, and it's about the size, as I said before, with this dude, the pituitary gland is the size of a garbanzo bean. The pineal body is about the size of a pea, especially in humans. So what you'll see right here, if you look, there's a little structure right in the midline. See that right there? A little thing I'm pulling up? Not this, that's blood vessel. That right there, that's the pineal body. Pineal body right there. Pineal body right there. That's only half of it. What happens when we cut through the middle of it, if we get lucky, we'll slice it in half. A lot of times, because it's so small, you'll slice over to one side or the other. So one half of the brain will have the pineal body, the other side of the brain will not have it. So the pineal body is this structure, as I said before, about the size of a pea. We'll cover this in lecture, but it's involved in circadian rhythms. and it's involved when we say circadian rhythms, like the normal rhythms of the different seasons. Okay, in women, it's probably involved. Well, we know it's involved in the menstrual cycle. It produces melatonin, which is a hormone for sleep, right? Not melanin, but melatonin. So that's pineal body right there. I don't see a good, there it is right there. You can see a little bit right there. And maybe, is it still intact here? Maybe a little bit. See how thin it is, how flimsy it is? So they easily get knocked off. This one doesn't have a pineal body because it's probably on the other half, or it was already knocked off. All right, midbrain, pons, and medulla. So when we talk about brainstem, we talk about the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So if you lay the brain out like this, the highest part is this portion right here. This is part of the middle part. It's called the pons. This is pons. It sticks up the highest. That's the pons right there. Sticks up the highest. So pons means bridge. It's basically a bridge between the two other parts of the brainstem. So then this portion right here that sticks up, it doesn't always stick up like that, but it's sticking up here. This is the medulla oblongata, Hakuna Matata for you Lion King fans. So medulla oblongata, and then this is the cord right here. So pons, medulla oblongata, and this portion right here. Remember we talked about the cerebral peduncles? Cerebral peduncles right here. This is the front part of this, the midbrain are the cerebral peduncles. So here's what we say. We say midbrain here, pons here, and then medulla oblongata there. Midbrain from here to here, pons to right about here, and then medulla oblongata right there. Midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Pons sticks out the most. If we do it again, oh, that one's torn. Midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, and cord. If we do it in cross section like this, it's a little bit tougher. This would be your midbrain. That means this, excuse me, midbrain. This is your pons. It means this is all midbrain, and then this would be your medulla oblongata back here, and then that's cord. I'll show you all as well. Here's the pons, sticks out the most. This is all this is all medulla oblongata. This is cord, and then from here up into here is all midbrain.
Something's wrong with his medulla oblongata.
What's that?
He was saying he's heard medulla oblongata, and I said water boy.
Yeah, that's right. Very good.
Very
All right.
Yes.
So now let's go back to the ventricles again. We are already familiar with the lateral ventricles. There are two lateral ventricles. That's why we call the one in the midline below it the third ventricle. So this is the left lateral ventricle. Left lateral ventricle. Remember, corpus callosum above and fornix down below. Left lateral ventricle. So there's a right. Then what happens is that fluid that's produced by these ventricles flows down through this little hole right here. It's actually a big hole. It's called the interventricular foramen, appropriately enough. Inter means between, foramen, okay? Interventricular foramen, and then it flows down into this space where the third ventricle was. Remember when I did this with my hands? Third ventricle, where the hypothalamus is, okay? Then that fluid flows, so we have fluid flowing from the lateral ventricles down in the third ventricle, and then that fluid will flow back here along this little groove right here in the midline. See that groove right there? That's called the cerebral aqueduct, the aqueduct of Sylvius or mesencephalic aqueduct. So the cerebral aqueduct, so we go from lateral ventricle to third ventricle. Back here, there's a cerebral aqueduct. Okay? Lateral ventricle down to third ventricle through this little hole, and then back through the cerebral aqueduct right here, to the fourth ventricle, which is at the base of the cerebellum. So the fourth ventricle sits right here, at the base of the cerebellum. Okay? Right there, fourth ventricle. Again, you can see it here, cerebral aqueduct. Lateral ventricle, third ventricle would be here, cerebral aqueduct to fourth ventricle right here. As I said, lateral ventricle, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct to fourth ventricle down below. Okay? So there are four ventricles. 1, 2, 3 in here. Cerebral aqueduct down to 4. So the fourth ventricle is located at the base of the cerebellum. Where is that? Well, let's take a look here. This is a better one. See the cerebellum in cross section? Does it look like a little bush? This is called the arbor vitae, which means tree of life. So at the base of the arbor vitae, right here, is where the fourth ventricle is located. Right here at the base of the base of the arbor vitae. So there's the arbor vitae, tree of life. There's the fourth ventricle, arbor vitae.
Could you say it's inferior to the medulla?
Well, it's not going to be inferior because it sits like this, right? Here's your medulla oblongata. It's going to be superior to
Superior.
it.
That's what I meant.
That's
Sorry,
right.
superior.
So
Yeah,
superior to it, and then the medulla oblongata,
Yeah,
you
okay.
bet, and there's your pons.
Perfect.
So there's the aqueduct of Sylvius, or mesocephalic aqueduct, going down to that space right there, fourth ventricle.
And in
So-
humans, would it be like medulla would be anterior and cerebellum would be posterior?
Yeah, because as I said before, because
Yeah.
they're quadrupeds, right? They're sitting like this.
Right.
We're going to sit more like this, right?
Gotcha.
So yes, you are correct. We covered cerebellum. So you can shut it down because we're going to bring a book out now.